Welcome to Healthy Canadians, your space for nuanced conversations and expert insights into the health topics that matter to us all. I'm your host, Beahen. With me, Alex Newman, co-host and producer.
Hi, Megan. So today is part 2 of our 2-part series on 988, the Suicide Crisis Helpline. And in the first part, we kind of talked about defining it, what is it, who is it there to serve, and all of those kind of things, understanding the service better. But today we're going to dig in a little bit more into what actually happens when you call. Who do you speak to? What sort of things can you access, and what that all looks like.
That's right. I think it's going to be a bit reassuring to let people know what that experience really is and who you might be talking to. So we're talking again to Dr. Allison Crawford and a responder from the helpline.
Absolutely. So before we jump in, though, just a quick word from us. So although Healthy Canadians is produced by Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, what we discuss won't always reflect the official policies or positions of the Government of Canada, but that's okay. These are conversations, not news releases.
Let's keep talking about 988. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what exactly happens when you pick up the phone to call or to text. So let's say I get on the phone, I'm calling, Aaron picks up. What is that? You gave us a little bit of an idea about what you offer, but could you tell us in practical terms, what does that conversation kind of look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. That's a good question. As what I would say usually which can be a non-answer. It's every call is different, but in general, in terms of kind of the general structure that we've been trained in with 988 and kind of just what I usually go through, is that when you're calling, after you kind of get through the question of kind of where, which service do you want to access, are you First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, or Inuit, and just kind of those questions. You'll be greeted with a responder that'll say something like, "Hello, 988 Suicide Crisis Helpline. What is you reaching out today?" And for me as a responder, I'll take the time to again give people the space to express what's going on, to give people that empathy, that compassion, that understanding, and just that space to express, to kind of offload the things that they're going through, and kind of after getting an understanding of what's going on, and to give the caller the space to talk about what's been going on. Most often I would usually kind of paraphrase and say something along the lines that sounds like a lot of things that are going on right now. I'm thank you for reaching out to 988. And I'll do the best I can to support you with what you're needing in this call. So once that happens, then I'll segue usually into risk assessment. So for example, I would sometimes say hey, just to check in with you, I just want to kind of to learn more about what's been going on. Can I ask have you had any thoughts of suicide in the past few days, including today? And also after they answer that, the other question would be have you done anything to harm yourself today? So those 2 questions are questions that all responders will be asking, regardless of kind of the nature of the call. And the reason why we ask those questions is for us as a responder to understand the context again, as kind of the level of safety, right? Where that will help inform us in terms of how we approach the call. Because I know that some people would be no, why are you asking those questions? Well, for me as a responder, I just need to know so I can help you out as best I can. And as I previously mentioned too, it's if there's any other risks that come up, domestic violence, child abuse, self-harm, other risks, I'll ask those questions too. Hey, just to check into, you mentioned these things, just kind of want to understand, and just kind of exploring those further. And then kind of once that's done, then I kind of go into asking hey, what are you needing from this call, right? Where if someone's looking just kind of for resources to support someone else, or if there's someone that is currently having thoughts of suicide and just want that emotional support, that's where I kind of get engaged with what they're needing from this call. But in terms of, let's say it's emotional support call, that's where I go through kind of that strengths-based approach, right? Where I'm talking about coping strategies, hey, it sounds has this happened before? If it has happened before, okay, what have you done before in the past to help you out with this situation? Also kind of exploring alternative options where it's hey, I know that you're thinking about suicide right now. What are some other ways that we can kind of manage with this situation that's going on? Other things I would be doing is kind of that validation piece, right? Where it's, again, giving them the space, giving them the recognition that their experience is valid, right? And that's where giving them that understanding that I am here with you right now. and that you don't have to go through this alone. And again, that piece that I mentioned of how this might be the first time they're reaching out kind of is my through line theme throughout this entire call, is because I want to give them the space to know that this is a space that, again, instead of having to keep it inside and to have them struggle alone, to feel that isolation, to feel that disconnection, this is a space for connection, right? And this is a space for that empathy and that perspective taking. Because as Dr. Crawford mentioned, we have a lot of different tools, but I think equally as important is that connection and is that empathy and that relationship building, in terms of rapport building between me as a responder and them as a service user, to let them know that they are not alone. And that itself helps so much in the calls that I've had. I've a little tangent, but in terms of some calls I've had where for them to tell me that I just needed someone to know that I mattered, that changes things, right? And that changes people's outlook to know that they matter and that they are worth something, and that there is someone out there that cares for them, right? And that itself can be that life changer. And then kind of once kind of that experience is kind of explored and all that, and that they're feeling a lot better, again, I offer that safety planning piece, where if they mention anything related to suicide, that's where I kind of offer, if they want to develop a safety plan. And people may not be as aware, and that's kind of something that, as me as a responder, that's kind of my kind of like sign, is like, hey, like, we can talk about safety planning, like this is important. And kind of just a little brief overview of what that involves is where it's like a 6-step safety plan, where if you're having thoughts of suicide, this plan is something that you can go through, that can help keep you safe. And it's individualized, right? Where we have a general structure of what that safety plan is, but that's where it's collaborative. Like, I'm working with the service user to figure out what works for them, and again, meeting them where they're at. But also, this is individualized for them and their life to make it so that they have that buy-in and they are willing to enact this safety plan when they're having these thoughts. So in terms of this safety plan, kind of high level overview is like, hey, like, what are the warning signs or kind of the triggers for your thoughts of suicide? What are your internal coping strategies? Like, what do you do to distract yourself when you're stressed out? Like, do you listen to music, podcasts, yoga, exercise, kind of like that kind of thing? The next step would be kind of, is there any people or is there any places that you can go or talk to distract yourself? Is there any people in your life that you trust to talk about this when you're in crisis? Is there any professionals or agencies that like you can talk to during this crisis? And lastly, is there any way that you can restrict access to lethal means? So that's where, if someone has like a specific means to end their life, is there a way for us to either remove that from the premises or to make it harder for them to access, so that they have the time to be like, oh yeah, like, I have a safety plan. Let me like have a look at that. Or like, oh, hey, like, I should probably connect with 988 because someone reminded me that this is why I'm doing this. So let me connect with them first before I do anything. So that's kind of that collaborative safety plan. And as well, an option that we have too is that we can offer some follow-up calls, again, based on the consent of the service user, where we can connect with them and check in on their safety, or if they want us to check in on them in the future, just to make sure, like, hey, like, how's things going since you last connected? Like, how's our safety plan going? Is there like adjustments that we have to need to make to help this be better for you at this time? So then kind of once that's done, then I kind of check in with them, just like, hey, like, how are you feeling now at the end of our chat or text? And then kind of once that's done, then I just kind of let them go upon their day. So most often kind of a lot of service users say like, thank you so much for doing what you do. Even if they don't say that, like, I can just tell just by the tone of their voice from the beginning of the call to the end of the call, that it was an important interaction. And that's kind of why, like, I do what I do, is to know that this is, again, sounds corny, but it is like life-changing work. So, a little snapshot of kind of just what a general structure of a call goes. Of course, there's different variations that happens. Hopefully that helps people kind of feel that comfort to know that that's kind of what we usually go through, and that it's not just we talk whatever we want to talk about. It's like there's some structure with some flexibility in there, and that's how kind of responders approach their work at 988.
It doesn't sound corny at all, Aaron. It sounds beautiful, really. Like, I think you gave a really good idea of what would happen. Like, really important details that make it a little bit less intimidating if you're planning to call, right? Yeah. And so thank you for that. I think it's also probably comforting to know that if you called in, you could talk to that same person again, or that person might check in with you again, right? So every time you call, you don't necessarily need to talk to a different person. Yeah. Yes, but
it might. We can't guarantee. Well, I will say that in terms of the follow-up call, we can't guarantee that's the same person,
right?
So that's where, just to give you that little piece where kind of whoever's on shift at that time, or whoever's on a shift, like that would be the person who makes the call. But in general, like that's where like we kind of want to facilitate that brief continuity of care, right? Where it's like if we are concerned of someone where like they have a safety plan, but there's still quite a few risks that we're kind of a little bit wary about. So that's where we, even for us, like to check in, like, hey, like how are you doing? And I think something that I would say as well that hopefully can help people feel more comfortable calling in is where I am very aware, and I think Dr. Crawford is aware of this as well, is where people sometimes are afraid of calling or texting or just connecting with these services because they're afraid of emergency services,
right?
Kind of it like intervening. And for me, what I can say is where emergency services is our last resort.
Okay.
It's not our first resort. That's where, to be very honest, like there are like a certain percentage of calls where we may need to activate emergency services, but that is where it is our last resort. As responders, and as like for us, like even for me, it's where we do not take any joy in activating emergency services. Like we don't have like a button to say like, hey, like emergency services, like that's not how it works. We have things in place that we work through to make sure that we can support them in the least intrusive way. So again, that's through just the model that we go through. It's like, hey, like, is there coping strategies? Is there things that you do in your life that can help you out? Is there that safety plan? Like, can we collaboratively develop a safety plan with you to stay safe? Can we offer you a follow-up call? Is there a way for us to check in with you to make sure that you are safe? So there are things in place that we do before we reach that emergency services. Because again, as a service, we have that obligation to make sure that we're protecting your safety and the safety of other people. But it's also balancing the understanding that we want to make sure that this is the least intrusive way. Because again, we are aware that emergency services can be traumatic for people. Kind of when like they are involved with mental health sometimes. So that's where for us to try to do it in the least intrusive way. So I just want to also put that out there because
it's an interesting point because I mean, as much as it's very important for us to be having this conversation to, I'm thinking of someone who might be listening, who might be thinking they want to call, but I can imagine it's a bit of a leap to make that decision too, to call for help. So, I mean, both hearing the experience around what happens when you call is really helpful, but also some reassurance around stuff because, and maybe Dr. Crawford, you could speak a little bit to the privacy side of things too. And and what are those responsibilities and when would someone, a responder need to trigger emergency services, for example, or privacy in general, what someone can expect when they call? Yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say that, Aaron, wow, you hit all the notes of all of the things. But I think responders are also very skilled. They know that these are the things that it's helpful to cover in a call because we know that those things are associated with good outcomes on calls, but they're able to weave that together in a conversation. I don't think that any responder really loses sight of that importance because the conversation itself is what establishes the connection and that empathy. They're doing all these things in the background, but I think that's really, and that also came through in what you were saying, Aaron. In terms of privacy, so we take that so seriously on 988 because we know people are calling in their most distressed and often vulnerable moments. Everything that, first of all, people don't have to give any information that they don't want to give. So we ask all kinds of questions, but it's really up to the person calling or texting what kind of information they want to provide. We also, within the network of providers, we have security of the information and don't share it outside of that network except under very exceptional like legal circumstances. But privacy is very, very important. And at the same time, on 988, we believe in saving lives and we believe in intervening. So we know that only a very few percentage of calls or texts, sometimes people need more than the responder can provide. And then as a last resort, we will involve emergency services. Again, just giving them enough information to intervene to save that person's life. So it's really when someone's life is at immediate risk.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's important to understand, right? Because it's a potential barrier too for someone to call.
At the same time, I also think, having 988, it gives people an alternative where they would have previously, or their family would have previously used 911. So this gives people an alternative that often works without, actually that almost always works without, it's really less than, or it's around 2% of calls where we involve 988. So in all those other 98%, the responders are able to help that person.
Thank you. So 988 is one way to just support someone who's in mental distress. Are there other things as well that people can do?
Oh, absolutely. I think, so when we're trying to support someone else, I think that we've talked a lot today about listening. So asking, listening, being with, those are really being with in a non-judgmental way. So sometimes, I think one of the unique things about 988 is not assuming people's experience and not jumping in with advice. And that's something that we can all learn from, that often we care about people. We want things to be better for them. So we want to jump in with, well, have you tried this? Have you done that? Well, this worked for me, or these vitamins worked, or this which can come across A, in a very overwhelming way, and B, it's probably not what we intend, but can come across as judgmental. If you did something else, you would feel better. Sometimes just listening and validating, you use that word, Erin, validating someone's experience. It's understandable what you're feeling. It's understandable what you're going through. So I think that being with and listening without overly giving prescriptive advice. Yeah.
And something I would say too is I can imagine that some people who may not be as familiar with crisis intervention feel like they're not doing enough when they're just listening or just being with someone, where they're on the edge of their seat. It's I want to tell them what to do, but it's kind of that counterintuitive, right? Where it's if you give them the space, if you kind of back off and just hey, tell me more. Obviously, again, within your own capacity. However, to be there to listen to people and being there with someone, that itself and having that space can be really beautiful, but also bridges that connection, right? And kind of gives them that permission to say oh, someone's willing to listen to what I've been going through. So I wanted to kind of add that in where it's you're doing a lot just by listening. Even if it doesn't feel like you're doing a lot, you're doing a lot.
I think that's really helpful. I can relate to that too. I'm a person who likes to get in the weeds and try to fix problems. So I've had that experience in my own life too, where I've been super unhelpful, I'm sure, because I'll just go in and say, oh no, you got to try this, do that. Let's solve this thing. When really I just need to kind of zip it and listen. To loved ones too.
Yeah. It comes from a good place. I mean, as not just a psychiatrist, but an oldest sibling. That's really, I think we've all been there with our advice. There is on 988.ca, there is information on how to have those conversations and also how to think about language. So some people find that very helpful.
Yeah, I think from talking with Erin, it's clear that from your experience that just the act of having that conversation with someone who's called and texted in is super helpful.
Yep.
So, Dr. Crawford, maybe you could tell us at the end of a conversation by phone or by text on 988, what happens next?
Right. So, I mean, if it depends on the call and what that person needs. So we really value collaborating with the person who's calling or texting and letting them kind of take ownership over what they need and what they want to do. So that's figured out on the call. We always tell everyone, you can always call again. So it's not a service you can only use once. It's not even a service you can only use once in one day. Sometimes we will encourage people to call back, or anyone can call back. The other thing is, if as part of that dialogue the person wants resources, we will work with them to figure out the appropriate resource. A very common one that we use is 211, because it's accessible in most communities in Canada, and they have a lot of detailed information. And then in some cases, if the responder does have ongoing safety concerns, and if the caller or texter consents to it, we will do a follow-up phone call just to check in. The one thing to say that the service is not is it's not a mental health navigation service. So it's not the place that you would call if you want a referral to a service, or if you want to speak to a psychiatrist or psychologist, or you want a referral. But you can talk about that on the line.
And get some tips to where to find those services, right?
So maybe we could close with some advice for someone who might want to call or text in, but they're a little bit hesitant. Aaron, let's start with you, because I can feel your energy.
He's ready to go.
Yeah, I think the goal is definitely to support everyone, but I also am fully aware that some people will never choose to reach out. And I understand that, and I accept that, right? Where I think what I could say to the person who's hesitating and who's like kind of ambivalent right now about whether or not they want to reach out or talk to someone, I think what I could say is to know that 988 exists. You may use it, you may not use it. You may continue to consider using 988. However, what I would say is that for 988 to exist means that there is someone there that can be there and ready and is willing to support you, and to know that you're not alone. I am aware of how hard it can be to think about these things and to figure out what you want to do. And as kind of what Alex mentioned, is where there's a big jump and a big leap between thinking about it and actually taking the action to call. It is not lost on me how hard it can be to pick up the phone, to dial numbers, and to stay on the line, and to stay on the line to talk with someone or to text with someone. That is not lost on me. I am aware that you could end the text, you could end the call at any point. But for me, in terms of the people I've interacted with, they choose to stay on the line with me because they are wanting help. We don't know what that help looks like, and that's kind of where we work together to figure that out. But what I can say is that for you to reach out, that is a sign of strength. I know a lot of people can think of that as a sign of weakness, and kind of the idea, this phrase of like, how could you have let it get to this point? But that's where for 988, like we don't judge. We know that people have lived a lot of experiences in their life, and I don't know specifically like the people's experiences before they call or text, but I'm very aware that things have happened in the past in terms of experiences with just like other people and just the invalidation, that I hope you decide to call and or text, whichever you're comfortable with, and to know that there will be someone with you in your corner helping you out and being there with you. We may not fix everything. We may not solve everything in that phone call or text. But again, just to have that conversation to let you know that you're not alone, I hope that is enough for you to consider reaching out to us.
Thanks, Aaron. I feel like you would be a good person to have in someone's corner.
Yeah, definitely.
And Dr. Crawford, what would you say to someone who's not sure about whether they want to make the call or the text?
Well, everything Aaron just said. But I think, there is a very well-known suicide prevention campaign that said things get better. And I think I always think about that. And that doesn't necessarily mean things get better in the future, in 5 years or 10 years, although certainly we hope that's the case. Things can get better in 15 minutes. And sometimes that is what makes the difference between somebody thinking about ending their life and deciding to end their life. And so just know things get better. Just the chorus of that conversation can help things even just get a bit better, and to be accompanied through that really difficult time. So number one, if just call or text, where we really want to connect with you.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Thank you for joining us in this conversation today. I think people are going to take away a lot of practical information, but also we got to know a little bit about Erin and what it's like and how supportive it is to call in. So thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning in to Healthy Canadians. If you're watching on YouTube, click the like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all future episodes. Find us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review if you like what you heard. For more information on health topics that matter to you, visit canada.ca/health.